Hello and welcome to a discussion on the topic the response of religious institutions to delinquency and crime. Let me begin with a very transparent fact. You see, right from the beginning, the subject of delinquency and crime has considerably attracted the attention of social scientists. This is evinced by the multitude of research work and papers one finds on the subjects addressing the various aspects and consequences of delinquency and crime. So, there is nothing to be surprised about when we see today that the latest trends in criminal activity as well as the new efforts to check and suppress crime has become a prime issue for scholars as well as politicians. This is why today we see that a great deal of importance is being attached to scientific evolutions and ongoing research of the best practices in curbing and controlling such social problems like crime, gang violence, teen drug abuse or even post-release recidivism rates for ex-prisoners. In a very parallel context, religion also arose the interest of social scientists for decades. A number of significant researches on the topics of religion, spirituality, religious practices and beliefs have been and still are of supreme importance to scholars and citizens alike. An interesting fact that can be noticed here is that these researches are majorly based on Christian population samples. But this does not imply that other religions or religious groups are not pertinent to these discussions or are of less importance. As a matter of fact, we hope that in the very near future we will begin to contrast and compare the various religious groups, traditions and faith communities. But let me mention here that this module broadly gauges data on existing research and therefore it can be very clearly noted that most of the data which has been sourced in this module comes from studies which dealt with a Christian sample group. Of course, there has been a lot of fancy surrounding theological, philosophical and historical studies of religion as well as tradition and faith-based institutions. But besides all this, there has also been an increased interest in the role of these faith-based institutions in challenging and resisting the ills of the society and fighting crime and delinquency. Scholars nowadays have become increasingly concerned to understand how religion can be associated, if at all, with civic engagements, volunteering by various social and civic groups and altruistic behavior more generally. You see, in the present circumstances, crime and religion receive a lot of independent attention from the academic community as well as from the popular media. But at the same time, it is interesting to note that despite all this, we still lack a substantial literature that can exactly determine the relationship between religion and crime or vice versa. But this, of course, does seem to be a natural line of inquiry for social scientists who have started addressing the relationship of religion and crime or the nexus as a whole in a meaningful way over the last decade. However, this happens to be an unfavorable oversight because from what we have understood in the present scenario, the religiosity crime relationship is quite a resilient and important relationship that has a profuse impact at both the theoretical and the public policy levels. As such, to understand the past, the present status quo and the future of the religiosity crime relationship, the religious institutions addressing the issues of crime, delinquency and offender treatment, as well as rehabilitation programs and the transition of prisoners back into the mainstream society. This module under discussion will take a holistic view on both the pros and cons of the religious institutions on crime and delinquency. What I intend to here is to encapsulate the present status quo and offer an explicit and concrete course of action for future studies and research. You see, over the last few decades, there has been an increasing curiosity to find out if religion increases crime, decreases crime, or has no effect at all on crime and criminal behavior in society. While discussing about contemporary research on the religion-crime nexus, it would be worthy of mentioning about the Hershey and Strack's classic study in 1969, Hellfire and Delinquency. What Hershey and Strack discovered was quite surprising. They found out that there exists no relationship between levels of religious commitment and criminal behavior among the youth. This work was both supported as well as refuted by subsequent researches on similar grounds. But it must hereby be noted that Strack and his colleagues cited that these differences were basically a representation of the moral makeup of the community that was being studied under the sample group. Yet in another study, Strack, Kent and Doyle suggested that areas with high church membership and attendance rates were considered to be the representation of moral communities, whereas those with low church memberships were representations of secularized communities. This moral communities hypothesis predicted an inverse relationship between religiosity and delinquency in moral communities. Besides the expectation that there was little or negligible impact of religiosity on individuals in secularized communities. It is this very theoretical perspective that became one of the important principles that helped subsequent studies to understand why some studies were able to establish an inverse relationship between religion and delinquency, while the others failed to do so. Also, what is to be seen is that the effect of religiosity remains paramount even in communities facing severe poverty or communities which appear to be socio-economically deprived in comparison to others. Another interesting point is that even in teens who were part of poor but moral communities, delinquency and drug abuse were found to be significantly lower than those who were not regularly exposed to religion or religious groups. Interestingly, in the contemporary and relatively newer studies, it can be seen that religious or engagements may lower the risks of a wide range of delinquent behaviors, including both minor and serious forms of criminal behavior. What has been found out from a plethora of research and studies is that most of these researchers explicitly exposed the inverse relationship between religion and delinquency. While some of the studies were debatable, only one study seems to prove that religion has actually intensified delinquency in a social community. However, the argument rests in the favor of the inverse relationship between religiosity and delinquency. The studies that found out the inverse relationship between religiosity and delinquency not only enforced elaborate research techniques but also conducted meticulous analysis of the given data. And those studies that were primarily unsettled and debatable were seen to be following primary research procedures, where the data was dealt in an inexplicable manner. You see, it therefore becomes clear that when the question of dealing with large sample groups of varied representation and comprehensive evaluation of the collected data is concerned, religiosity shows an inverse relationship with delinquency. Let me just put it in this way: youth who have a dominant exposure to religion show a narrow tendency towards delinquency and any sort of deviant activities. What I say can further be evinced from the detailed analysis of most of the religious studies from 1944 to 2007. These studies concern a broad variety of subjects like children, adolescents, high school students, college students, community dwelling adults, elderly, church members, etc., and are also different in types, like some are cross-sectional, some prospective cohort, some retrospective, some clinical trial, some experimental, some case control, some descriptive, some case report, so on and so forth. Not only this, but even the sample methods are very discrete to ensure the sacrosanctity and the originality of the reports. Notwithstanding the type of study, sampling technique or subjects, it is mostly seen that religion has indeed helped it reducing the rate of delinquency and deviant behavior among all sections of the society. Well, you see, religion is considered to be a very strong and resilient variable which is associated with reduced tendency of criminal behavior and deviant activities among the different social groups, and therefore it can be explained why scientists and scholars today are accepting this inverse relationship between religion and delinquency. You see, without doubt, it can be said that there is clear and distinct empirical evidence that religious commitment is associated with crime and delinquency reduction. However, researchers have spent little time to study how religion encourages prosocial behavior and administer its protective factors on the subjects of the respective studies. Therefore, it becomes very important to understand the link between religion and the protective factors which help in the reduction of delinquency and criminal behavior in society. First, let me speak of connecting religion to protective factors. You see, recent research has looked into the dynamics of crime and criminal behavior and its association with religion, and have traced that religion has acted consistently to reduce the proclivity of criminal behavior, particularly among the youth. This point has been found out by Johnson and others with significant evidence. Such studies had a particular approach. the approach was to first determine the impact of neighborhood disorder on the youth and the regressive effect that religion had on this youth, especially on these belonging to high crime neighborhood regions. A particular study even showed that the alarming effects of the neighborhood disorder was somewhat alleviated by the individual's frequency of church attendance. Another approach was to determine the role of African American churches on the African American youth in preventing them from deviant behavior and serious crime. What was found was that the kids who had regularly visited religious institutions or faith-based groups have a considerably low tendency of associating themselves with delinquent behavior, criminal activities, or even drug abuse. This finding convinced the researchers that the African American church possesses the potential to be an important agency of local social control. But these were preliminary findings. Recent researches also confirm the fact that religious commitment and faith-based involvement help to protect the youth from delinquent behavior and deviant activities. The important factor here is that such influence of religious groups often persists even if a subject is living in a hard neighborhood, that is to say, areas influencing a tendency of crime. In other words, youth from bad places can indeed turn out to be good kids if religious beliefs and practices have a regular and important role to play in their lives. You see, subjects who had a considerable religious influence throughout their adolescence show a significantly low tendency towards criminal activities even in their adulthood. It can therefore be asserted that a regular exposure to religion protects a child or a young adult not only from immediate delinquent or deviant activities, but also from future criminal activities and behavior. Parental devotion to religious activities and devotion to religion as a whole is equally important, since it ensures a reduced tendency of delinquent behavior. Also, as I have previously stated, young adults and children from disadvantaged households who have a higher tendency to indulge in crime and criminal behavior happen to show lower tendency of criminal and delinquent behavior if they have a proclivity towards religious activities. Thus, religion is indeed a protective and crucial factor that insulates children and young adults from criminal and delinquent behavior. Secondly, I come to the promotion of prosocial behavior. You see, for centuries, social scientists have tried to answer two of the most fundamental questions relating to crime and criminal behavior whenever they have undertaken any research dealing with delinquent behavior and deviant activities. The first question concerns the factors which prompt people to commit crimes, and the second one is usually related to the methods of prevention of crime and criminal activities. These two questions are linked to the study of religiosity and crime when one tries to see how the constant involvement with faith reduces the purposes of committing crime. If one emphasizes on the factors that promote prosocial behavior, he will need to assert the influence of religion and faith in preventing deviant activities among anti-social elements of a community. Other than these two fundamental questions that were raised by social scientists and criminologists, there is another inquisitive statement that seems to find the spotlight with the arrival of scientific research in the contemporary age is, the question is, why do people not commit crime? Several social control theorists like Travis Hersey have provided a very extraordinary perspective on this issue. Hersey stated that there are many important reasons as to why people do not commit crime or engage themselves in deviant behavior. If we can study and then emphasize on those factors that prevent people from breaking the law, it would ultimately help us to understand prevention against crime and criminal behavior better. And this should eventually help us to prevent criminal behavior and deviant activities in society. So, religion, as you can see, acts as a bonding factor because it helps to bond an individual to the society. Hersey has spoken about 4 elements in his study at the heart of his social control theory. It is easy to see how religion plays a central bonding role among these elements, namely attachments, commitments, involvements and beliefs. I have already stated that religion provides a buffer factor to children and the youth, and hence it prevents them from engaging in delinquent behavior. It must also be noted here that there is an equally important and understudied question that one needs to know. The question of what compels people to do good things. To put it very simply, if you can encourage people to do good, then in a way you are actually reducing the bad activities of a society as a whole. Having said thus, let me now say that the approach of research in case of prosocial behavior should change from why people commit crimes to why people do good. Encouraging people to have a prosocial mindset would very conveniently bring down the antisocial ideals and helps in building a better and more developed society as a whole. Thus, the role of religion in fostering this idea of doing good in society makes us believe to a large extent that religiosity does not only reduce deviant activities, but it also encourages positive prosocial beliefs. Talking of prosocial beliefs, well, a number of studies have been published in recent years documenting the relationship between increasing religiosity and higher levels of prosocial behavior, and these studies testify the fact that religious commitment promotes beneficial outcomes like well-being, hope, meaning and purpose and self-esteem. Besides, some studies also suggest that being involved in or being exposed to altruistic or prosocial activities and attitudes, something that most churches and faith-based organizations do actually and significantly results in reduced risks of youth violence. Apart from all these, there is sufficient empirical evidence that suggests that religious commitment is also a source for promoting or enhancing beneficial outcome like well-being, hope, meaning and purpose, educational attainment and charitable giving. All these diverse studies bring us to the conclusion that in general the effects of religion on physical and mental health outcomes are remarkably positive. Besides, the findings have also encouraged some religious healthcare practitioners to infer that further alliances between religious institutions and health services may be advisable. In conclusion, it can therefore be asserted that of course there exists an inverse relationship between religiosity and crime, and religiosity enables a subject to reduce deviant activities and manifests prosocial behavior. Of course, we cannot overlook the fact that there are some researchers who have found that low religiosity is a risk factor for adolescent health risks behavior, and that religion measures are not routinely included in adolescent research. Churches, synagogues, mosques, inner city blessing stations, and other houses of worship are the institutions which can be found in close proximity of most adolescents, their families, and their peers. There is abundant research suggesting that these religious institutions can also help the health and the well-being of those they serve. So what must be noted is that while authorities throughout the world are trying to curb the escalating crime rates and deviant activities, religion can be seen as a feasible solution to the problems of delinquency and deviant behavior. It is evident, however, that any policy or program will be needlessly incomplete unless religious communities are integrally involved in the process. With this, we come to an end of the discussion on the topic, the response of religious institutions to delinquency and crime. We will meet again in some other discussion on some other module. Thank you.